Great. Thank you very much, Grant. And just want to say a big thank you to you and to Nada for just, for the invitation and for steering me through. I don't always begin by saying, oh, this is work in progress, apologies. But this time it's a genuine proviso here. I'm an art historian who's always been interested in politics, and I find myself writing about politics rather unexpectedly and sort of when there seems no alternative, really, in a way. A certain situation after the invasion of Iraq and so on just precipitated afflicted powers rather unexpectedly. The situation we're now in just has provoked, a kind of somewhat agonized and desperate political thinking on many people's parts, and these notes, and they are notes, are meant as a contribution to that. It's work in progress, it's not apologetic. I mean, it's quite vehement in places, and it gets me and you probably in sort of rather strange places we'd perhaps prefer not to be. Okay, but that's enough of preliminary. There is an epigraph. It's from this wonderful book by the painter and writer, anti-fascist Carlo Levi, chronicling his exile sort of for anti-fascist activities. He was exiled to a small village in Basilicata in southern Italy, and his book, which I couldn't recommend more highly, called Christ Stopped at Eboli, is one of the great testaments to one of the great descriptions, I think, of a certain peasant culture. Here's the epigraph. How deceiving are the contradictions of language. In this land without time, the dialect was richer in words with which to measure time than any other language. Beyond the motionless and everlasting cry, meaning tomorrow but also never, every day in the future had a name of its own. The day after tomorrow was prescry, and the day after that pescrile. Then came pescruflo, maruflo, marflone. The 10th day was maroflicchio. But these precise terms had an undertone of irony. They were used less often to indicate this or that day than they were said all together in a string, one after another. Their very sound was grotesque, and they were like a reflection of the futility of trying to make anything clear out of the cloudiness of the future. This is a very strange time to be talking about the left, and some of you will feel a particularly strange time to be suggesting that it may have and might benefit from having no future. The world economic order is in crisis. Riot and occupation and the smell of tear gas are reasserting themselves as ordinary aspects of everyday life. The US imperial system is genuinely destabilized in at least one part of the world, the Middle East, though the effort to sew together a new alliance of usable generals and Islamo-democrats is already going strong. It surely looks like it ought to be a time when left politics was again a possibility, and it may be. The question follows, is this the time to be talking, as I'm going to, about the tenor and rhetoric of left politics, as opposed to the opportunities opened up and the kinds of demands now made plausible by specific local or national catastrophes? Various answers to this occur. The weak one would be that the as opposed to in the previous sentence is unnecessary and in practice a recipe for chaos. Opportunities fast become opportunism, and demands veer wildly from manic to depressive. World revolution in February, defend local shopkeepers in March. A stronger answer would be to point to the nature of the political situation itself, which seems to be taking on a more and more total form, an all or nothing character for those living through it, with every successive month. And in reality, as opposed to the fantasy world of left conferences, this is as unnerving for left politics as for any other kind. The left is just as unprepared for it. The silence of the left in Greece, for example, its inability, I don't mean by that a literal silence, and I don't mean that I don't greatly admire the efforts of certain parts of the left in Greece, but I'll still say what I have to say here. The silence of the left in Greece, for example, its inability to present a program outlining an actual persuasive default economic policy, a year-by-year vision of what would be involved in Greece taking the Argentinian road. That's indicative. And in no sense is this meant as a sneer. When and if a national economy enters into crisis in the present interlocking global economy, what has anyone to say in any non-laughable detail about socialism in one country, or even partly detached pseudo-nation state, non-financed capital-driven capitalism? Is the left going to join the Tory Eurosceptics in their dream of deglobalization? The notes that follow are addressed to the left in the old capitalist heartland. They have nothing to say about capitalism's long-term invulnerability, and pass no judgment, what fool would try to in present circumstances, on the sureness of capital's management of its global dependencies or the effectiveness of its military humanism. The only judgment presupposed in what follows is a negative one on the capacity of the left, as it exists at present, to offer a perspective in which capitalism's failures and its own might make sense. By perspective, I mean a rhetoric, a tonality, an imagery, an argument, and a temporality. To the extent that these notes come across as pessimistic, my strong reply, I've given you two cautious ones, is simple. What other tonality, I would ask, seems adequate to the past 10 years? How are we meant to understand the arrival at last of real ruination in the order of global finance? This sucker could go down, to quote the words of George Bush in September 2008. And then the almost total failure of left responses to it to resonate beyond the ranks of the faithful. Or to put the question another way, if the past decade isn't proof that there are no circumstances capable of reviving the left in its 19th and 20th century form, then what would proof be like? The question for the left at present, in other words, is how deep does its reconstruction of the project of enlightenment and of its own assumptions and identity, how deep do these have to go? How far down? Some of us think 7 levels of the world. The book we need to be reading, in preference even to the coming insurrection, I feel, is Christopher Hale's The Experience of Defeat. That is, the various unlikely and dangerous voices I find myself drawing in these notes. Nietzsche, in spite of everything, Bradley and Vernon on tragedy, Burckhardt's astonishing and dreadful Homo necans, man the killer, Benjamin in his hour of darkness, Adorno looking down his nose at the world from Pacific Palisades, Ludd looking out from the dustbin of history. These come out as resources for the left only at a moment of historical failure. We read them only when events oblige us to ask ourselves, What was it in our previous stagings of transfiguration that led to the present debacle? Two questions give form to what follows. First, what would it be like for left politics not to look forward, to be truly present-centered, this-worldly, non-transcendent? By which I mean leaving behind, in the grain and frame of its self-conception, the last afterthoughts and images of the avant-garde. And second, could a left politics, the kind shadowed forth in the phrase "with no future," be transposed into a tragic key? Is a tragic sense of life possible for the left, for a politics that remains at all recognizably in touch with the tradition of Marx, Raspail, Morris, Luxembourg, Platonov, Sorel, Pasolini? Is such a sense, such a tragic sense, necessary? What do I mean then, first, by tragedy or the tragic conception of life? The idea applied to politics is strange, and to the left probably unwelcome. So my treatment of it will be as plain as can be managed, which needn't in this case mean banal, I hope. Bradley, the great literary critic, the great writer on Shakespeare, is, in my view, a tremendous late Victorian guide. He addresses his students mainly about Shakespeare, but almost everything in his general presentation of the subject resonates for me with the left's current task. Tragedy, we know, is pessimistic about the human condition. Its subject is suffering and calamity, the constant presence of violence in human affairs, the extraordinary difficulty of reconciling that violence with a rule of law or a pattern of agreed social sanction. It turns on failure and self-misunderstanding, and above all on fall from a great height, a fall that frightens and awes those who witness it, because it seems to speak to a powerlessness in man, and a general subjection to a force or totality derived from the very character of things. Tragedy is about greatness come to nothing, but this is why it's not depressing. Man may be wretched and he may be awful, says Bradley, but he is not small. His lot may be heartrending and mysterious, but it is not contemptible. It is necessary, I'm quoting still, that the tragic project should have so much of greatness in its error, should have so much of greatness that in its error and fall we may be vividly conscious of the possibilities of human nature. Those last two words have traditionally made the left wince, and I know why, but they may be reclaimable. Notice that for Bradley, nature and possibility go together. It may be necessary in present circumstances for the left to recapture them, human nature alongside the equally problematic nature in general. Bradley has a great passage on what he ventures to describe as the center of the tragic impression. I'll quote it in full. And again, I'm saying that these, I think, are remarks on the human condition that are very much political remarks and enduring political remarks. This central feeling is the impression of waste. With Shakespeare, at any rate, the pity and fear which are stirred by the tragic story seem to unite with and even merge in a profound sense of sadness and mystery, which is due to this impression of waste. We seem to have before us a type of the mystery of the whole world, the tragic fact which extends far beyond the limits of tragedy. Everywhere, from the crushed rocks beneath our feet to the soul of man, we see power, intelligence, life, and glory, which astound us and seem to call for our worship. And everywhere we see them perishing, devouring one another and destroying themselves, often with dreadful pain, as though they came into being for no other end. Tragedy is the typical form of this mystery, because that greatness of soul which it exhibits, oppressed, conflicting, and destroyed, is the highest existence in our view. It forces the mystery upon us, and it makes us realize so vividly the worth of that which is wasted that we cannot possibly seek comfort in the reflection that all is vanity. Great passage. And one thing to be said about it, and I mean this more than an aside, is that it can serve as a model of the tone of politics in a tragic key. The tone is grown up. And maybe that's why it registers as remote, even a trifle outlandish, in a political culture as devoted as ours to a ventriloquism of youth. The present language of politics, left and right, participates to the full in the general infantilization of human needs and purposes that has proved integral to consumer capitalism. There's a wonderful counterfactual desperation to this phenomenon, for consumer society is by nature, by reason of its real improvements in living standards, grey-haired, if not white-haired. The older the average age of the population, we might say, the more slavishly is its cultural apparatus geared to the wishes of 15-year-olds. And this, too, the left must escape from. Gone are the days when infantile disorder was a slur, an insult from Lenin no less, that one part of the left could hope to reclaim and transfigure. A tragic voice is obliged to put adolescence behind it. No more Rambo, that is. I mean, I speak as a worshipper of Rambo, right? But no more Rambo. No more apodictic inside out. No more elated denunciation. Here again is Bradley. The tragic world is a world of action, he tells his students. And action is the translation of thought into reality. We see men and women confidently attempting it. They strike into the existing order of things in pursuance of their ideas. But what they achieve is not what they intended. It is terribly unlike it. They understand nothing, we say to ourselves, of the world on which they operate. They fight blindly in the dark, and the power that works through them makes them the instrument of a design that is not theirs. They act freely, and yet their action binds them hand and foot, and it makes no difference whether they meant well or ill. Politics in a tragic key, then, will operate always with the sense of the horror and danger built into human affairs. And everywhere we see them perishing, devouring one another, and destroying themselves. This is a mystery. But again, quoting Bradley, this time pushing him a little in our political direction, tragedy is the form of this mystery that best allows us to think politically, because the greatness of soul which it exhibits, oppressed, conflicting, and destroyed, is the highest existence in our view. It forces the mystery upon us, and it localizes the mystery. It stops it from being an immobilizing phantom. It has any one politics, our own, for instance, be carried on in the shadow of a specific political catastrophe. Very hard to look at this image, there's a sort of grand guignol dreadfulness to it, but on the other hand, I don't see any way to avoid an image like this if this is our topic. It's a photo taken of poor peasants lined up with their rakes and scythes as part of a, anti-kulak campaign in around 1930, right? The anti-kulak campaign, which of course resulted in the slaughter of how many millions of kulaks? Uncountable, uncountable. Our catastrophe is the 70 years from 1914, and by the way, how many of these manipulated poor peasants survived is also a big question. Our catastrophe is the 70 years from 1914 to 1989. And of course, to say that these central decades of the past century, at least as lived out in Europe and its empires, were disastrous or intolerable, is to do no more than repeat common wisdom. Anyone casting an eye over a serious historical treatment of the period, the one I never seem to recover from is Mark Mazauer's terrible conspectus, Dark Continent, Europe's 20th Century, is likely to settle for much the same terms. The century of violence, I remember an old textbook calling it the time of human smoke. The political question is this, however. Did the century's horrors have a shape? Did they obey a logic or follow from a central determination? Here's where the tragic perspective helps. It allows us not to see a shape or logic to the last 100 years. It opens us, I think rightly, to a vision of the period as catastrophe in the strict sense, unfolding pell-mell from Sarajevo on, certainly until the 1950s. And if we widen our focus to Mao's appalling proletarian cultural revolution, in a sense the last paroxysm of a European fantasy of politics, well on into the 1970s. A modernity comes suddenly from nowhere, it seems, overtaking the certainties of Edwardian London and Vienna, a chaos formed from an unstoppable, unmappable crisscross of forces, the imagined communities of nationalism, the pseudo-religions of class and race, the dream of an ultimate subject of history, the new technologies of mass destruction, crucial those, the death throes of the white man's burden, the dismal realities of inflation and unemployment, the haphazard but then accelerating construction of mass parties, mass entertainments, mass gadgets and accessories, standardized everyday life. The list is familiar. And I suppose that anyone trying to write the history that goes with it is bound to opt, consciously or by default, for one among the various forces at work as predominant. There must be a heart of the matter. This leads to the question of Marxism. Marxism, it now seems, was most productively a theory, a set of descriptions of bourgeois society and the way it would come to grief. It had many other aspects and ambitions, but this was the one that ended up least vitiated by chiliasm or scientism, the diseases of the cultural formation Marxism came out of. At its best, in Marx himself, in Lukács during the 1920s, in Gramsci, in Benjamin and Adorno, in Brecht, in Bakhtin, in Attila Joseph, in the Sartre of La Conscience de Classe chez Flaubert, at its best, Marxism went deeper into the texture of bourgeois beliefs and practices than any other description save the novel. But about bourgeois society's ending, it was notoriously wrong. It believed that the great positivity of the 19th century order would end in revolution, meaning a final acceleration but also disintegration of capitalism's productive powers, the recalibration of economics and politics, and a breakthrough to an achieved modernity. This was not to be. Certainly bourgeois society, the cultural world that Gramsci and Picasso took for granted, fell into dissolution. But it was destroyed, so it transpired, not by a fusion and fission of the long assembled potentials of capitalist industry and the emergence of a transfigured class community, but by the vilest imaginable parody of both. Socialism became National Socialism, communism became Stalinism, Modernity morphed into crisis and crash. New religions of Volk and Gemeinschaft took advantage of the techniques of mass destruction. Franco, Dzerzhinsky, Earl Haig, Eichmann, von Braun, Mussolini, Teller and Oppenheimer, Yang Qing, Kissinger, Pinochet, Pol Pot, Ayman al-Zawahiri. This is the past that our politics has as its matrix. It's our Thebes. But again, be careful. Tragedy is a mystery, not just a charnel house. Thebes is not something we can put behind us. No one looking in the eyes of the poor peasants in the photograph I've had on the screen, lined up with their pikes and Stalinist catchphrases, off to bludgeon a few kulaks down by the railway station, looking in the eyes of these dupes and murderers, dogs fighting over a bone, and remembering perhaps with Platonov's help the long desperation the camera does not see. No one who takes a look at the real history of the 20th century, that is, can fail to experience the sense of sadness and mystery Bradley points to, which is due to the impression of waste. And everywhere we see them perishing, devouring one another and destroying themselves as though they came into being for no other end. However we may disagree about the detail of the history the kolhoshniks in the photograph are living, at least do them the justice not to pretend it was epic. Historical materialism must renounce, this is Benjamin of course, historical materialism must renounce the epic element in history. It blasts the epoch it studies out of the reified movement of history, but it also explodes the epoch's homogeneity and intersperses it with ruins, that is, with the present. The shed on the right in the photo might as well be a lager, and the banner read, Arbeit macht frei. Quote, "The world is now very dark and barren, and if a little light should break forth, it would mightily refresh it. But alas, man would be lifted up above himself and distempered by it at present, and afterwards he would die again and become more miserable." Thus, the great Puritan Isaac Pennington in 1654. Pennington thinks of the situation of defeat and dissolution and Cromwell in place of everything he had hoped for. He thinks of the situation in terms of the fall, but his attitude to humanity can be sustained, and I think ought to be, without the theological background. His speaking to the future remains relevant, and it can coexist fully with the most modest, most moderate of materialisms, the kind we need. This is another Puritan voice. You complain. Well, I'll tell you before I read it, actually, because it's so fascinating. This is a man called Moses Wall, writing to John Milton in 1659, when they knew it was over. It was over. I mean, it's amazing that Milton escaped with his life at all. This is what Moses Wall said to him. You complain of the non-proficiency of the nation and of its retrograde motion of late in liberty and spiritual truths. It is much to be bewailed, but yet let us pity human frailty. When those who made deep protestations of their zeal for our liberty, being instated in power, shall betray the good thing committed to them and lead us back into Egypt, and by that force which we gave them to win us liberty, hold us fast in chains, what can poor people do? You know who they were that watched our Saviour's sepulchre to keep him from rising. He means soldiers. He knows about standing armies. Right? That's his fear. Yeah, quite right. Besides, he goes on, whilst people are not free, but straightened in accommodations for life. This is a famous, extraordinary passage. While people are not free, but straightened in accommodations for life, their spirits will be dejected and servile. And conducing to reverse this, there should be an improving of our native commodities, as our manufacturers, our fishery, our fens, forests and commons, and our trade at sea, etc., which would give the body of the nation a comfortable subsistence. Still a great maximalist program. When, in a battle between cities, says Nietzsche, the victor, according to the rights of war, puts the whole male population to the sword and sells all the women and children into slavery, we see in the sanctioning of such a right that the Greek regarded a full release of his hatred as a serious necessity. At such moments, pent-up, swollen sensation found relief. The tiger charged out, wanton cruelty flickering in its terrible eyes. Why did the Greek sculptor again and again have to represent war and battles? Endlessly repeated, human bodies stretched out, their sinews taut with hatred or the arrogance of triumph. The wounded doubled up in pain, the dying in agony. Why did the whole Greek world exult in the pictures of fighting in the Iliad? I fear we do not understand these things in enough of a Greek fashion, and we would shudder if we did. Slightly different direction then, facing the question of violence, which of course is sort of constantly there in thinking at all about the tragic dimension. Don't think, I want to say, that talk of propensity to violence is just Germanic, Nietzschean. Listen to Hazlitt, speaking from the ironic heart of the English radical tradition. Nature seems, the more we look into it, made up of antipathies. Without something to hate, we would lose the very spring of thought and action. Life would turn to a stagnant pool were it not ruffled by the jarring interests, the unruly passions of men. The white streak in our own fortunes is brightened or just rendered visible by making all around it as dark as possible. So the rainbow paints its form upon the cloud. Is it pride? Is it envy? Is it the force of contrast? Is it weakness or malice? But so it is that there is a secret affinity, a hankering after evil in the human mind. Protestants and Papists do not now burn one another at the stake, but we subscribe to new editions of Fox's Book of Martyrs. Contemporary equivalents might be the Gulag Archipelago or Scenes from Abu Ghraib. We subscribe to new editions of Fox's Book of Martyrs, and the secret of the success of the Scotch novels is much the same. They carry us back to the feuds, the heartburnings, the havoc, the dismay, the wrongs and the revenge of a barbarous age and people, to the rooted prejudices and deadly animosities of sects and parties in politics and religion, and of contending chiefs and clans in war and intrigue. We feel the full force of the spirit of hatred with all of them in turn. The wild beast resumes its sway in us. We feel like hunting animals, and as the hound starts in its sleep and rushes on the chase in fancy, the heart rouses itself in its native lair and utters a wild cry of joy. This has more to say, alas, about Dera and Abbottabad, or Geert Wilders and George Osborne, than most things written since. It's a logical error of the left to assume that a full recognition of the human propensity to violence, to blood-soaked conformity, closes off the idea of a radical reworking of politics. Not so. The question is, what route is it we need to get down to? And even a Hazlitt-type notion of a hankering after evil in the human mind can perfectly well coexist, as it did in Hazlitt's own post-Augustan generation, with a "by our own spirits are we deified." Human capacities may be infinite, They've certainly been hardly explored, hardly been given their chance of flowering. But the tragic sense starts from a recognition that the infinity, the unplumbable, is for bad as much as good. It's likewise wrong to assume that moderacy in politics, if we mean by this a politics of small steps, bleak wisdom, concrete proposals, contempt for grand promises, a sense of the hardness of even the least improvement, is not revolutionary, assuming this last word has any descriptive force left to it. It depends on what the small steps are directed to changing. It depends on the picture of human possibility in the case. A politics actually directed step by step, failure by failure, to preventing the warlike tiger from charging out would be the most moderate and revolutionary there has ever been. I quote again, to put it briefly, what will never again be built anymore, cannot be built anymore, is a society in the old sense of that word. To build such, everything is lacking, above all the material. All of us, this is Nietzsche and he means us modern, all of us are no longer material for a society. This is a truth for which the time has come. We moderns are no longer material for a society, and in the sense that the Enlightenment was premised on, perhaps we never were. The working out of this realization will be terrible. The passage just quoted famously devolves into a sneer at good socialists and their dream of a free society, built from wooden iron, Nietzsche says, or maybe Nietzsche prophesies from iron on its own. After socialism, he believes, will come chaos, a crisis that purifies, that pushes together related elements to perish of each other, that assigns common tasks to men who have opposite ways of thinking, of course, outside every existing social order. And the upshot is as follows. Who will prove to be strongest in the course of this? This is Nietzsche. The most moderate, those who do not require any extreme articles of faith, those who not only concede, but actually love a fair amount of contingency and nonsense, those who can think of man with a considerable reduction of his value without becoming small and weak themselves on that account, human beings who are sure of their power and who represent with conscious pride the strength that humanity has actually achieved. Of course, I'm not inviting assent to the details, such as it is, of Nietzsche's post-socialism. His thoughts on the subject is entangled with a series of naive, not to say nauseating, remarks on rank order as the most precious fruit of the new movement. But as a sketch of what moderacy might mean to revolutionaries, his note goes on resonating. Utopias. This is the great Bruegel's comment on the most powerful and widespread of peasant utopias, the land of Cacain, right? The land of absolute plenty, right? Of total, where pigs run around with knives in their hides, sort of asking you to cut them apart and eat them and so on, right? And fences are made of sausages and the tiles on the roof are tarts and so on and so forth, all right? I mean, it's a peasant utopia, but actually very, very interesting. I mean, is it a utopia or always an ironizing of utopia? Very hard to tell. But this is Bruegel's vision of it. Utopias, by contrast, are what the masters have time for. They're modernity's dream of itself, a nowhere for intellectuals. Bruegel, in his usual way, spells this out. His peasant Cacain is a parody of the world to come. It is a de-sublimation of the idea of heaven, an undivine comedy which only fully makes sense in relation to all the other offers of otherworldliness, ordinary and fabulous, instituted and heretical, circulating in his late medieval, early modern world. What the painting most deeply makes fun of is the religious impulse, or one main form that impulse takes, the wish for escape from mortal existence, the dream of immortality, the idea of transcendence itself. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. There shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. What the painting says back to the great book of Revelation, and surely its voice was that of peasant culture itself in one of its ineradicable modes, is that all visions of escape and perfectibility are haunted by the worldly realities they pretend to transfigure. Every Eden is the here and now intensified. Immortality is mortality continuing. Every vision of bliss is bodily and appetitive, heavy and ordinary and present-centered. The man emerging from the mountain of gruel in the top right corner is the modern subject personified. He's eaten his way through to the community of saints. The young man on the ground, here in the foreground at right, with the pens at his belt and the Bible by his side, we could see as none other than St. Thomas More himself, awake but comatose in his utopia. And the lad gone to sleep on the top of his flail, who but the kolkhoznik himself. Utopias, in my view, reassure modernity as to its infinite potential. But why? It should be learnt, be taught to look failure in the face. You may ask me finally, what's the difference between the kind of anti-utopian, present-centered politics I'm advocating, with the tragic perspective so powerfully there, and reformism, pure and simple? Well, the label doesn't scare me. The trouble with the great reformists within the socialist internationals was that the reformists shared with the revolutionaries a belief in the essentially progressive, purgative, reconstructive destiny of the forces of production. They thought the economy had it in it to remake the human phenotype. Therefore, they thought reform was a modest proposal, a pragmatic one. They were wrong. The essential and noblest form of socialist reformism, Bernstein's, came juddering to a halt in 1914 as war happened, as the great cycle of 20th century atavisms began, as a socialist project in the middle of barbarism. Reformism proved unrevivable. Reform, it transpires, is a revolutionary demand to move even the least distance out of the cycle of horror and failure, to leave the kolkhozniks and waterboarders just a little way behind, will entail a piece by piece, assumption by assumption dismantling of the politics we have. I'm going to just leave that one out. Yeah. What, in the trajectory of enlightenment, the trajectory that the left inherited, I mean, the great arc from Hobbes to Nietzsche, say, or from de Maistre to Kojève, what were the distinctive strengths of the right? A disabused view of human potential, no doubt always on the verge of tipping over into a sanctimonious rehashing of original sin. And deriving from the first, an abstention from futurity, right? I'm pointing to the right's strengths in its dialogue with the left. Nietzsche, as usual, is the possible exception here, but the interest of his occasional glimpses of a politics to come is, as I've said, precisely their ironic moderacy. Does the right still possess these strengths? I don't think so. It dare not propose a view of human nature any longer, or if it does, it is merely Augustinian, betraying the legacy of Hume, Vico, even Freud and Heidegger. And slowly, inexorably, the right too has given in to the great modern instruction not to be backward-looking. The right has vacated the places or tonalities that previously allowed it, to the left's shame, to monopolize the real description and critique of modernity. The left has no option but to try to take the empty seats. The tragic key makes many things possible and impossible, but perhaps what is central for the left is that tragedy does not look forward. Here's just my last element of these notes. The modern infantilization of politics goes along with, and perhaps depends on, a constant orientation of politics towards the future. Of course, the orientation has become weak and formulaic, and the patter of programmers and gene splicers more absurd. Walter Benjamin would have recoiled in horror at the form his weak messianism actually took when the strong messiahs of the 20th century did go away. The Twitter utopia joins hands with the Tea Party. But the direction of politics resists anything the reality of economics, even outright immiseration, making a comeback as it is, can throw at it. Politics, in the form we have it, is nothing without a modernity constantly in the offing, at last about to realize itself. It has no other telos politics, no other way to imagine things otherwise. The task of the left, I believe, is to provide one. Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will? Not anymore, because optimism is now a political tonality indissociable from the promises of consumption. Hope is no longer given us for the sake of the hopeless. It has mutated into an endless political and economic Micawberism. Presence of mind as a political category, says Benjamin, comes magnificently to life in these words of Turgot. Before we have learned to deal with things in a given state, they have already changed several times. Thus, we always find out too late about what has happened, and therefore it can be said that politics is obliged to foresee the present. To end by rephrasing the question posed earlier, the left in the capitalist heartland has still to confront the fact that the astonishing, statistically unprecedented, mind-boggling, great leap forward in all measures of raw social and economic inequality over the past 40 years have led most polities, especially lately, although maybe at last there's some sign of an alteration, but fragile, have led most polities to the right. The present form of the politics of ressentiment, the egalitarianism of our time, is the Tea Party. In what framework, then, could inequality and injustice be made again the object of a politics? This is a question that, seriously posed, brings on vertigo. Maybe the beginning of an answer is to think of inequality and injustice, as Moses Wall did when he wrote to Milton, as above all epiphenomena of permanent warfare, of the permanent warfare state, of the standing army state. And to frame a politics that says unequivocally, peace will never happen. It is not in the nature of human things that it should. But that recognition for the left only makes it the more essential, the more revolutionary a program, that the focal point, the obsession of politics, should be to contain the effects and extent of warfare, and try, the deepest revolutionary demand, to prize aggressivity and territoriality apart from the nation-state form. Piece by piece, against the tide, interminably, no doubt. In the same spirit as a left which might focus again on the problem of poverty, for of course there is no left without such a prime commitment, all the more fiercely for having Jesus' words about its permanence ringing in their ears. To pursue a previous point one step further, the question of reformism versus revolution seems to me to have died the death as a genuine political question as opposed to a tired rhetorical flourish. To adapt Randolph Bourne's great dictum, extremisms, the ones we actually have, are now the health of the state. The important fact in the present capitalist heartland is that no established political party or movement any longer even pretends to offer a program of reform. Reforming capitalism is tacitly assumed to be impossible. What politicians agree on instead is revival, resuscitation, re-regulating the banks, in other words, returning to the golden age of Nixon and Edward Heath. It surely goes without saying that a movement of opposition and this would be another way of thinking the bogus nature of the reform revolution contrast. It surely goes without saying that a movement of opposition of the kind I've been advocating, the moment it began to register even limited successes, would call down the full, crude fury of the state on its head. The boundaries between political organizing, peaceful political organizing, and armed resistance would break down, not of the left's choosing, but as a simple matter of self-defense. Imagine if a movement really began to put the question of the permanent war economy and the armed, expansive state back on the table in however limited a way, with however symbolic a set of victories. Be assured that the brutality of the kettle would be generalized. The murder of Jean-Charles de Menezes would be multiplied 1,000-fold. But the question that follows seems to me this: what are the circumstances in which the to and fro of state repression and left response could begin, however tentatively, to delegitimize the state's preponderance of armed force? Not for sure when the state can show itself collecting severed and shattered arms and legs from the wreckage of tube trains. Extremism, to repeat, is the state's ticket to ride. There will be no future, I'm saying finally, without war, poverty, Malthusian panic, tyranny, cruelty, classes, dead time, and all the ills the flesh is heir to. Because there will be no future, only a present in which the left, always embattled and marginalized, always proudly a thing of the past, struggles to assemble the materials for a society Nietzsche thought had vanished from the world. And this is a recipe for politics, not quietism, a left that can look the world as it is in the face. Okay. Thank you very much.
Do you have any questions?
Yeah.
If you could just give us a minute, we'll pass the mic around.
Sure.
I can maybe start with a question.
Right, yeah.
During your talk, I kept on thinking about Stoicism, and when you said bleak wisdom, I thought maybe this is in a way kind of reminding me of Stoicism, which in a sense, my understanding of it is that it is a kind of, on some level, pessimistic philosophy, in the sense that some of the Stoic advice was to, for example, not to look forward. One thing was not to look forward to the future unless you try to imagine, for example, your death or some kind of extreme situation of pain or violence, so that you would be prepared for that when it happened. Inevitably, it might happen to you. And I also thought of Marcus Aurelius' book Meditations, which was written, it was a very kind of gloomy, pessimistic book, which is written in a state of permanent war because he was traveling in Europe. And he was basically coping with this sort of uncertainty and the possibility of death at every point. And it seems that, to me, that maybe the aim was in a sense to maintain sanity in any kind of situation. And I was wondering whether this might be a kind of something similar to what you're proposing in terms of a kind of ability to cope with the present situation. It might be to maintain sanity and avoid this idea of a kind of utopian dream, like the one that you have on the screen.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's right, and I mean, you know, and it immediately leads us back to the question, which surely has been sort of on everybody's mind as they listen, and it's on my mind as I talked. You know, is that this extremely fine line between. I don't want to use Nietzschean catchphrases, but let's say, right, the fine line between a pessimism of strength and a pessimism which in the end is a kind of wallowing in impossibility, weakness, catastrophe. I think there is such a thing as a pessimism of strength. I think that, you know, in other words, it seems to me that a recognition of everything that still has to be tackled in order to shift politics even slightly towards defensible goals. You know, it's hard to. I think that can coexist with a great deal of confidence about the possibility of such a shift, right? It's going to be a shift. It's not going to be a shift towards some kind of transfigured, realized future, but it could be a shift towards a delegitimizing of very, very much, right, that the present order of things wishes to have as the given, the immovable. But in order, I think, to make a shift in the given and the immovable, you have to really recognize what it is that makes for the immovability.
Yeah, it's interesting. Also, I think in one of the emphasis in Stoic philosophy, in my understanding, is a kind of understanding of the nature of things, how things really are, and maybe this is what you're saying. This kind of this sense of kind of decipherment and attention to how things really are.
Yes, that's right. And the Stoics that's a very good. I mean, it's a very interesting example in that one, as I understand it, it's a sort of philosophical movement that is coping with a moment of tremendous shift and dissolution, all right, with the sort of moment in which the kind of Roman imperial order and its inheritance of Greek pagan culture, right, is in some kind of extraordinarily threatening free flow. So it's a sort of, it's a kind of coping mechanism. But it's not necessarily a coping mechanism which just says, well, look, nothing is possible, cultivate your own private virtues, right? I mean, you know, Marcus Aurelius didn't cultivate his own private, you know. In other words, Stoicism, recognitions of this kind can lead to action and engagement rather than, you know, rather than make one give up.
I've been quite influenced in recent years by Antal, Frederick Antal, coming out of Lukács and the Sunday Circle. And he was here in England in after 33. And he published in the 40s his big book on the Florentine Republic, where he looked at the period between Giotto and the Franciscan optimism and the century and a half before the Renaissance really started to take place. And I always felt, reading the introduction of that book, that it's very much a kind of metaphor for what he thought, even in the 40s, that he was going through, this research he'd done in the 20s. And he still felt it was worthwhile to write it up in the 1940s. And so that idea, not of progress of any kind, but that we might be living through this long period of decline.
Yes.
And one's interest in art as a way in which one sees things happening prior to them happening in the bigger society, in the political society. So the kind of Berlusconi finances, you know, connects with me, for me, so nicely with Damien Hirst and what's been going on around Tate Modern in this country.
Yeah.
But the problem that I had with what you were sketching was this outline of Russia. I was recently at the EU conference in Wrocław, and I gave a paper on Picasso at the Wrocław Congress in 1948. And Picasso said very little that was really of any interest. And so I settled on reading out Ehrenberg's paper, where he was talking very deliberately in 48 about coming from Moscow across the ruins of Europe, and saying that Moscow, in a way, has as much right as Paris to see itself as a European capital, and certainly has much more right to see itself as a European capital than Washington. And he goes on to talk about Russian literature. Where would European literature be without Tolstoy and Dostoevsky? Where would European literature be without music, be without Tchaikovsky and people?
Yeah.
And that took me back to something that Antal seems to have taught Klingender, which is the idea that Russia, certainly at the time of the revolution through to the 20s, and he felt it was still, when he spent 1932 in Moscow, it was still really a medieval society, that it was literally a couple of centuries less developed than what was happening in Western Europe. And the kind of combination of these things leads me to a slightly even less optimistic view than you're giving. And I just wonder the extent to which these kind of issues and our total failure to take Russia on board since 1989 has been affected by, I mean, the legend is you went to America because you couldn't stand Thatcherism. But since...
if only it were anything that grand, yeah.
Can you see what I'm kind of
Yes.
echoing around?
Yes. I mean, I'm staggered actually to hear you say that my view of, you know, of the tragedy of Bolshevism isn't tragic enough. But you know, that's yes. But you know, like you, I think I've spent far too much of my life sort of reading and thinking about 1917 and afterwards. And I did say at one point, you know, whatever our view of what the particular way to understand, say, something as dreadful as what was in that photograph, let's at least extract it from some kind of epic narrative of history unfolding itself.
Well, what I'm saying is what
Yeah.
was in that photograph was the medieval, the peasants from 2 centuries ago, in comparison to the working class after the Industrial Revolution in Western Europe.
I think that, look, I understand what you're saying. I think the temporality built into that is I think, it comes a little, I'm choosing my words carefully because I don't want to, I understand your point and it's a very serious one, but just beware of this, of a certain kind of explanation / excuse for the tragedy of Stalinism that the left can offer itself, right? That what else was possible in a medieval society, that Russia was the very last place where socialism had a basis.
I'm reading
Yes. No, go ahead.
I just want to interject another point here. I did find the image of the peasants slightly perverse, and the reason is to add to this from another angle. I come from the Middle East, and for decades we fought a colonialism and American imperialism, and our cultures have been progressively destroyed and parceled up within, not unlike a scenario that is being placed here. And the point here is that following on from the medieval context, which actually still exists in many parts of the Middle East, we have been put into a position where, and also in this discussion that we are having, as if there isn't a larger scenario. For example, the political left is largely non-existent in the Middle East, and the reasons are complex. But one of the obvious and clear ones is the collaboration of the ruling elites with the what you call the heartlands of capitalism. But I disagree with you in the positioning that you've proposed, because you're not giving me any actual political analysis. I mean, you have to, I think, put into place a current context. For example, you mentioned the possibility of a state, permanent state of war. We have it. It's Israel. Yeah. So then I do want to put this to you. I come from the political culture, and it is to me essential to direct the discussion finally to concrete points, and
Yeah.
this is also important in the discourse of the left, I think.
Yes. I think it's absolutely, the right kind of challenge, the right kind of trouble you have with what I'm saying. I mean, I began at the beginning by saying, look, I know there's something very strange and in some ways bizarre about daring to focus on the question of language, tenor, rhetoric, right, sort of meta problems, right, of the nature of the left at a time of the extraordinary sort of shifts, opportunities, particular evolving political situations, major instabilities of a new kind. I absolutely agree with that. And actually, I mean, I tried to write something about the relationship of what I was saying to the situation in the Middle East. I'm very dissatisfied with it in the end. I mean, I can sketch that out for you, but I mean, I think I didn't do it because I thought that in the end I wasn't, I didn't have it worked out, and I think, I wasn't in control of the information. I mean, it's extremely difficult to know, what the political dynamic in somewhere like Egypt at the moment really is, and I was very, very well aware of the limits. Just the only thing I would say back to you, though, so I'm admitting to the strangeness of insisting that, look, part of what the left here in the capitalist heartland must be doing, in my view, is to sort of think about why its vision of the future and its account of politics has failed to resonate in the way it has. It's got to think its relation to the tragedy of politics, and particularly of left politics in the 20th century. All right, I still hold to that. Although, if that's all it does, if all it's doing is sort of a kind of dreadful self-examination, of course that's terrible. That's futile. The only other thing I'd like to say, and it just does relate back to this, you see, I really do believe that the left has to dispose at last of the Marxist historical epic, the temporality that goes with it. And that's why I really don't in the end like the idea that that so-called peasants, that label covering a tremendous complexity of sort of social positions and social orders. But I don't like the idea that the kolhozniks in 1930 or the various small landed proprietors that are still so important in parts of the Middle East should be described as medieval. I mean, they're fully modern citizens. As somebody put it a couple of years ago, I mean, look, it's a very, very important part of globalization, that globalization is so incomplete that every day, literally tens of thousands new proletarians are created, right? That the process of globalization actually forces people, right, off the land, robs them of their so-called peasant status and turns them into landless laborers or purveyors of labor power on the market. That's an incomplete process. It's a modern process, right?
I agree that this, I think, is absolutely correct. This displacement and movement and what comes with it. However, I think it isn't a singular and linear
Yeah.
condition. I think there are different and unconnected multitude of positions.
Yes.
The other thing which I want to say to you, you're repeating to me the capitalist heartlands being here. My point to you is that these are the dying heartlands.
Yes.
Heartlands are now in the east.
Yes.
They are not here,
Yeah.
and the new colonial powers are not from here. They're
No.
from
Yes.
China, India, Turkey, etc., colonizing large parts of Africa, etc. But at the same time, within it, they also contain the medieval peasants.
Yes.
I think it's the feudal system that was there in Russia, not the individual peasants.
Yes, but
it's that
but
feudal system
yes, but
which we had overthrown in
yeah.
Western Europe much earlier.
well, not yes, much earlier, but you know, Europe was very yes. You see, feudalism. You see, what I'm saying is, I want us to reject feudal equals medieval. Right, then you have bourgeois capitalism, and you know, I just think this whole sort of temporality actually sort of, you know, it just fails to deal. Yes, the chronology goes on failing to deal with the multifaceted and contradictory reality. And I totally agree with you that, look, I did talk about the old capitalist heart. Maybe when I rewrite it, I'll dying, yes, dying. Although, you know, again, this is paradoxal. I was talking to Grant before we started about, you know, what it means for a Brit who sort of, you know, fled from London in the late 1970s, sort of coming back after actually longer than 25, you know, sort of more like 35, 40 years later, and just sort of going out on the Dockland Light Railway and just sort of seeing this astonishing and grotesque boom city, right? The sort of Thatcher Blair finance capital boom city. You know, in
Old as well.
I beg your pardon?
It's already old.
It's already old, and it, you know, I think it'll probably go back into a sort of, you know, it'll become a kind of neo-ruin. But wow, what an astonishing piece of, you know, social overdevelopment. Yeah.
I had a question in regards to the point about Stoicism and thinking about the ways in which one within the context of this place, if you like, which, as Maya has already pointed out, is not necessarily the heartland, but in terms of thinking about strategies. And I am troubled deeply and endlessly by the idea of a kind of Stoicism, you know. It seems that there's a kind of oscillation between doing what Guy Debord did, which is to kill himself, and at the opposite end of the spectrum, the idea of staying stumm, which is equally problematic in terms of finding one's place. Yeah. And I think that it is critical. I do take your point about seeing the notion of the epic in a different context, within a different sort of framework, if you like. But in trying to find pragmatic solutions to dealing with, it's not inertias.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it is a consistent corrosion of a positioning. And, you know, Rancière addresses the context of the politics of education, for example, the politics of change. And I imagine that a large proportion of us here in the audience function, live, exist, operate on whatever level within the context of these sorts of educational institutions.
Yeah.
And in that context, it does consistently become an extraordinary witnessing to have to witness the silencing of voice and any kind of, the word democratic is highly problematic, so forgive me for using it in this context, but with any kind of sense of equality or consideration to a liberation of, you know, the underprivileged, equality, all those kinds of issues. And I just, you know, you've spent most of your life in the context of teaching in institutions, and albeit you're back here and perhaps working in a very different, within a different sort of framework. But I wondered if, and this is a question which is a very small aspect of, it seems, the wider paper that you've put forward to us this evening. Nonetheless, it is a component of the human condition that we as individuals are confronted by and with. And I wonder what your thoughts are in terms of thinking through, you know, strategies and you know, making any substantial change that isn't necessarily intended on some sort of epic scale.
Yes.
At this moment of crisis.
Very, very tough question. Just to preface my reply to that with, you know, just a word or two, you know, I don't want to, you know, I don't want the word Stoic or Stoicism to sort of sum up what I'm, the perspective I'm proposing. And I certainly don't want the word pragmatism. I'm not really advocating a pragmatism. I'm actually saying that if we think seriously about a movement that sets itself concrete goals which go right at the unthinkable, the immovable, the assumed by all right-thinking or all serious parties and so on, right? You know, in other words, the question again of the permanent war state, and the question again of poverty and inequality. If we try to think those in terms which own up to everything that stands in the way of sort of progress on those fronts. You know, I don't see that as a sort of recipe for, you know, opportunistic, floating pragmatics. I see that as a possibility of a sort of different kind of realistic left politics. Now, I couldn't agree with you more that this has just got to coexist all the time, right, with saying, well, what do I actually do in my, you know, in my particular situation. I just came back earlier this week from I still do teach, you know, and I was teaching at York and then going over to do some stuff at Leeds University. And, you know, I mean, as you well know, everyone is absolutely reeling from this extraordinary, you know, ruthless privatization of the academy, and you know, just the kind of throwing away of the idea of humanities as, you know, as a necessary part of a sort of civilized polity, really. You know, it was astonishing. So there was a lot of talk about it, and I think no one has any, you know, let alone least of all me, no one has, you know, any very startling or surprising proposals here, right? You go on resisting, you go on talking hard to students, you know, who are, you know, the powers that be are trying to recruit them ideologically into the position of education consumers. And you know, I think it's highly possible and necessary to resist that, right? You know, by day in, day out dialogue about, you know, well, what is teaching and learning? What has it to do? You know, can it be orchestrated around a market model and a consumption model and so on? And I think real progress is possible here, right? I think, you know, it's already happened, hasn't it, to some extent, right? There is resistance, and I think there will continue to be resistance against heavy odds.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm just, I like very much your characterization of contemporary politics as infantile. And I'd like to hear more about that, if you don't mind expanding a little.
Sure. Well, it you know, again, it's very hard to do this without sort of sounding ridiculously, you know, lofty and antiquated, right? But we're also frightened of sounding lofty and antiquated, you know, because I mean, actually, this again is tremendously striking for someone who's lived most of their adult life in America, coming back to Britain. The way in which there's a kind of institutionalized pseudo-young, pseudo-cynicism, pseudo-nihilism, right? You know, as sort of the hip discourse, right, of the stand-up comedy media world, you know. I mean, just churned out night after night by the TV channels and all the rest of it. And the way in which there is that sort of extraordinary continuity between the, you know, the phony cynicism of that cultural formation and the language of politics, right? How extraordinarily difficult it is now for political thinking to be phrased in terms which, you know, which escape from this world, right? Which, you know, which sort of try to be grown up and disabused about the nature of the problem, about and you know, possible steps towards its solution. I mean, sort of, you know, this is amazing, right? And of course, it's very, very deep in. You know, it's very much more than a political fact or a fact of the last 20 or 30 years of media. I mean, there's a way I think that consumer capitalism has always gone along with a kind of infantilizing of social life, right? You know, kind of generalized pepping up, you know, sort of the caffeination of everyday life, right? You know, which is sort of, and you know, the availability of sugar alcohols, and you know, it's all right. It goes right. I mean, caffeine, sugar alcohols. You know, the whole battery of 17th, 18th, 19th century globalized, addictive commodities. So it's deep. It's deep, and sort of actually, you know, trying to kind of dig your way out of the idea that social life is structured around addiction, consumption, cynicism, extraordinary program, actually, right? It's a tough political program, but I don't see that the left has any hope if it doesn't try. By the way, but you know, don't, very difficult issue this, but I beware of giving Debord's suicide any world historical weight, you know? Right? I mean, he killed himself because he was, you know, he drunk himself to death anyway, and, you know, and I mean, so alcohols and, yeah, okay, right. You know, again, I'm not wishing to badmouth the guy, but look, you know, it wasn't a kind of cynicism of grand despair. It was, you know, it wasn't a suicide of grand despair, as far as I understand it. It was a suicide of, you know, well, I think I've, you know, just come to the end of bearable life.
It would have been so much nicer to think about it as an example of pessimism of strength.
Yeah, it would.
I just wanted to understand all this. And am I right? Probably I'm not, but I'm just thinking, are you actually advocating the return to the grand narratives, to the unfinished Enlightenment project, the project of enlightenment? But we are trying to redefine the notion of progress, and the progress which is not to be associated with consumerism, with actually making economy. I mean, it's not something which can be solved by making the world or the richer. I mean, not the world, but us richer. But rather, it should be redefined in terms of parity, of equal participation, of distribution, or whatever there is a proper term for that. So, yes, that's the question.
Yes, I mean, it's a subtle question. I mean, on one level, I think I'm trying to advocate an end to grand narratives, you know, and to say that we really should escape from the idea of a temporality which is directed towards a future in which there is, in any sense, the break, the realization, progress. But I mean, of course, that cannot mean that a politics doesn't have a view of what it wishes to achieve and that it hasn't achieved it yet. And so, you know, in some sense, of course you're directed. That's actually, I think, what Benjamin says in this sort of paradoxical thing that I quoted a little bit. I was a little bit wary of quoting it because it is so hard to understand, and I'm not quite sure I understand it. But, you know, where he quotes Turgot saying, a real politics has to always foresee the present. I think, as I understand that, that's something to do with always taking advantage of certain things that are happening around you, which are reconstellating a possible present, which hasn't quite yet happened. So you foresee it, but you don't foresee it as what's the word that's hovering? You know, I want to try. Yes.
Which is appropriated by the dominant.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah, so I think it is, what I'm saying is a little bit more than let's escape from the consumer future. I think that escaping from the consumer futurology involves us actually, you know, dismantling the whole idea of future directedness more radically, really. And to some extent that is escaping from the project of enlightenment. I sort of hate everyone dumping on the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was marvelous, but you know it leaves behind certain certain things I think we still have to escape from.
May I just ask a question?
Yeah.
Yes. Great. I just wanted to. I missed out on the must-read book you mentioned at the beginning. The must-read book by Levy, I think.
Yes. Oh yes, it's called Christ Stopped at Eboli. Christ Stopped at Eboli, which is, you know, by Carlo Levi, Levi. Great book. I mean, it's a very, you know, again, I quote it with some diffidence, because you might. It gets us back to the idea of medieval peasants, etc. You know, all this equation of peasant with past. He is dealing with a very isolated, and tragic peasant culture there in Basilicata. But he's full of a passionate regard for it, and its extraordinary dynamism and courage in the face of the immovable. I went back to, if you really want a sort of story here, in September I went to Aliano, which is he disguises it a little in the book, but it's where it is. And of course, Aliano now, of course, is not isolated, not medieval in the least. The big towers, TV towers from which Berlusconi's rubbish, emanates, are up there on the hill, and the CCTV surveys the street, and there are bankomats, and there were great trucks full of concrete coming in to build, new houses. So you're sort of faced with the fact, yes, peasant society does come to an end, but come to an end in favor of what?
This might be a good point for me to ask you. It sounds slightly deranged, but where do you locate the left? Because you're talking about the left, so which left? Where is it? And who are they?
Yes, well, I know this is a question which I've been asked many times before, actually. I mean, they are, look, I think pessimism on this can go too far, right? Look, there is this extraordinary moment. The left is always on the point of saying, we've vanished, the term's defunct, there are no more of us left, etc., right? And then strange things start to happen. They don't necessarily align themselves with, the left at all securely, and least of all do they align themselves with, most sort of sectarian theoretical versions of leftism. But I would say that the occupation movement is a left movement, in search of a left perspective.
Do you think Ed Miliband is capable? Do you think Ed Miliband is capable of looking tragedy in the face?
No. No. I'm afraid not. I mean, he'll have his own little tragedy.
So you mentioned the occupation movement. I was thinking while you were talking about Benjamin's notion of leftist melancholia, that Wendy Brown elaborated on very nicely a couple of years ago. But actually, it made me think about, you're also obviously talking about the 20th century and what happened after the Second World War and all of these new configurations of power. But we are now surrounded with the questions of how the movements like the operaist movement of the 70s turned into this self-exploited cognitariat of the 90s with the 2.0 generation, right? Yeah. So it seems like when thinking about the Occupy movement, what happened is that actually this cognitariat of the 2.0 generation got somehow the body, right? So this disembodied multitude actually got the body. So you said that probably there needs to be a point where this left will find a way to articulate itself or find clear agendas. However, I recalled a recent article by Mackenzie Work talking exactly the opposite, claiming exactly the opposite actually, how basically the abstraction of the Wall Street can only be attacked or challenged by the abstraction without necessarily pointing to very precise agendas, at this point at least.
Yes. Are you asking me what I think of that?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a sort of Mackenzie Walk kind of argument, isn't it? I don't think much of it actually. You know, I don't really warm to or understand the terms. Nor do I actually think that, you know, the sort of the kind of Negri type notion of the cognitariat sort of really, I've never really believed it actually, to be honest.
So you don't believe, you're like Boris Groys, he also doesn't believe in material labor.
Well, I mean, I don't believe in, I don't believe that the kind of, the arrival of a certainly significant and numerous kind of crowd or group of isolated digital workers actually refounds or reorients class structure. I just don't believe that, and I think actually everything we know about the occupation movement suggests it's actually not founded in and around,
it's the opposite,
some kind of group that sort of recognizes itself as a new, again, this is sort of, I think it's futurology. The cognitariat will lead us through to the promised land. Just don't believe it.
Yeah, but doesn't it seem that actually what you're saying about the future is should somehow point to the fact that the future needs to be politicized? I mean, in this, post-political era that we are now, we need to find ways to politicize the future, not to kind of dismantle the idea of the future as something that should resolve or kind of save us all, but somehow find ways to actually make it political, to kind of really give it a political.
Well, I think that is definitely the debate, and I think there could be, I think we could have I think the left could have a real argument about that. Again, I'm not saying that one disposes or could possibly dispose of the idea of political goals. I think one disposes of the idea of the tiger leap, right? The leap into the future as a sort of realizable other to the present. I just think that with that comes, has come a horrifying deformation of left thinking, because it usually goes along with the notion that in order to achieve this breakthrough, any kind of ruthlessness is necessary. And I think it also, is just radically misconceived in its notion of the possible.
Is there anywhere? Is there anywhere, or should we dispose of this idea of building a new world? So there is no where to build.
I think we should dispose of the idea of building a new world. Yes, building a new world. What a bizarre modern. It's an idea which inherits all of modernity's arrogance, I think.
It was the avant-garde.
Yes, and the avant-garde was full of it.
150 years of decline.
Yeah.
Is this why you keep going back to the Enlightenment? Because that for you, well, not that you're going back, but just in terms of, you quoted the reference to Milton.
Yes.
And
the context of the human condition, understanding things in terms of the present somehow.
Yes. Yes, that's right. I mean, look, I am a tremendous admirer of so many aspects of the Enlightenment. We're now talking, I think, more about the horrifying deformations of certain Enlightenment presuppositions about, human potential, human progress, the arrival of a subject of history that would become transparent to itself and remake all this, right? I mean, I suppose we're talking about institutionalized Marxism in many of its guises. So, I think we still are working. I think we're still working our way out of this, and we need to. And I think the actual, what better moment to do so than this moment of sort of, chaotic complexity, the sort of absolute collision of different temporalities and moments of history, but so much instability and so much possibility, really.
In light of that, I was at a lecture very recently by Kaya Silverman, in which she was discussing the context of. I'm going to have to be very careful how I rephrase this, but she talked about the presence and the moment of exhibiting, if you like, the moment of exhibiting the present. She was referring to the context of various artists' work. And one of the things that she seemed to also be raising questions around was Benjamin's writing in relation to modes of production and the multiple. She began to come back to this moment of locating the individual, if you like. And I wondered in terms of, I'm trying to think on my feet here, so forgive me, but I'm wondering in the context of what you said about the epic, and then coming back to the point of the present and the very particular. I wonder again, and it's very difficult as, again, the question of who is the left, what is the left, what left, but nonetheless, it is difficult to believe that you survive in isolation. There is, if you like, an intellectual kind of connecting with those other individuals within the context of a sort of framework to build something beyond that isolated space that we each inhabit. It is problematic, trying to think about resolving inertia, and undoubtedly, probably most of us in this room are constantly, mindful of the dynamic.
Yes.
Well, I actually agree with your point. It's about the evidence of the avant-garde, in relation to what you're saying. Of course, in the current context, what we have played out is the schism or this secular left, the position of the religious ideology, let's say in the Middle East, Islam, and it's actually very interesting, I think, in relation to what you've been saying, because if only the left understood and came out of its historical shackles
Yeah.
and actually understood the multitude of possibilities and began the discourse with the multiple options and possibly alliances, also intellectually, because it is clearly no longer an either-or scenario that we are in, and this to me is perhaps the only possibility, and it's not about a future world which might be a better world. It's what we have, and and where do we find points of realignment. But I think it looks to me, having been talking to large numbers of people, and particularly in light of Egypt recently and elsewhere, it looks to me that this may not be possible. And the reasons appear to be yet again external, that the strings are being pulled from many other directions.
That's a pessimistic.
There really is, but there isn't an autonomous position here. Then in that sense, there is no freedom of choice. It looks.
No, I know, and I certainly, one of the things that's actually been a little bit chilling is the over-eagerness of, certain very, very well-meaning, and that's some of them very dear friends of mine, but sort of, the over-eagerness of certain, British and American leftists to sort of see the Middle East, the Middle East Spring as sort of breakthrough and revolution. But, that's a complex issue. Can I just say one thing, and maybe the last thing before, in reply to you, I think you heard Kasia talking at Whitechapel, and I heard her the next day at Tate. And in both, I think she was certainly talking about, what are the conditions in which either or thinking might be dismantled. It comes back to your point. And she too seemed to be sort of thinking in very root and branch terms, right? That she's sort of looking to certain kinds of art just because it seems to be dismantling this kind of the Manichaeism of politics, right and left.
Well, that's not my reading of it. I read it more that she was trying to reframe it. So to understand it through a different context of meaning, of language, So in other words, she was proposing, if I'm not mistaken, that we need to re-enter how we begin to look at it. But she did, of course, as you've said yourself, if I've not misinterpreted what you said, she did question the avant-garde, and and I thought that the arguments she presented were very interesting in terms of thinking about a strategy precisely within the context of practice, within the context of the domain of the field of the visual arts, if you like. But nonetheless, I think that what she did consider for me, I didn't have a time to really engage with her about it, but I was interested in the context of what Rancière has written, actually, in terms of his thoughts and ideas around education and truth.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm getting there.